what's happened on average yields for soybeans, and I think this speaks to a lot to what's going on in the world. The U.S., Argentina, and Brazil effectively are about the same yield. We may have a record yield this year. We'll see. China somewhere down there well below the U.S., Argentina, and Brazil, and India much further down. We're going to supply the world in the future, countries that are going to have to step up and recognize that they need to bring the yields up. And China has got the capability to do that. India less so because of weather, but they can still advance their yields. But China and the rest of them are going to recognize that biotechnology is going to have to be a future for them. They're going to have to boost their yields. And one way they can do it is with biotechnology. Harvested area of soybeans in the U.S. this year is our record amount, according to USDA, that we will harvest. And I think that's pretty phenomenal when you consider the yield growth we've seen in corn, how well soybeans are able to compete. But a lot of that growth in soybeans has come out of wheat, and it's come out of cotton, because those crops are not doing well in the global market. So we're, in fact, expanding. If we get, within the next 3 or 4 years, a pretty good chance we're going to start getting drought-tolerant soybeans. And when that happens, we're going to push the soybean area even further west and push in on the wheat further. Wheat's losing out because it doesn't have any biotechnology. They choose not to go that way. Now they're beginning to reverse their position and support it, but they better get going fast because soybeans are expanding into those areas. Argentina soybean production, as you can see, went from 47 or 48.8 and then all the way down to 32 this year. That has really tightened up the supplies globally, but a projection to come back next year. Here's the growth in soybean consumption. As you can see, we've had continuous growth, except in 2003 we didn't grow because we had a terrible crop that year. So we cut back supplies, and a lack of supply limited growth. And we had a big drop in consumption this year. Argentina crop is part of it, but also the global economic recession has caused us to have less demand. We're projecting a growth next year of 9.7 million tons. I think that's interesting. I said this earlier to one of the participants here, and I said, you know, that if you look over the last 15 years, you could almost say, and I really think there's a case can be made, the biggest single limiting factor to demand for soybeans was supply. We could have consumed more and would have consumed more at some periods over that period if we'd have had the supply. But we're basically using up what we grow. We may not do it that year, but if the supply is there, you do tend to consume it up over the removed time. Ending stocks, these are on September 1 of each year, and that's significant because on September 1, South America has just finished harvesting 5 or 6 months earlier, and they've got half their crop available there. So it's in fact still much shorter stocks this last year, this September 1st, than in previous years. What's key, though, is if you look at the ending stock estimates for each country during its marketing year. And there you can see that in 08-09, which is, will be for the Argentine crop and Brazilian crop ending next February, we're looking at very low stocks in the U.S., Argentina, and Brazil. We're not going to have much left, any of the countries. In the U.S., 3 million tons. South America, Argentina, they're going to be sweeping out the bins at the end of the year to supply down there because 32 million tons production, 45 million tons or 50 million tons of crush capacity or more. So certainly that's a case where the supplies are going to be tight. The same in Brazil. Now we're projecting us to build stocks this next year. We'll see if that's the case. I'm not sure how much we will build in the next year. It depends on how much we can move in the next 5 or 6 months. Here's an interesting one to look at, is that in 08-09, 211 million tons of production, 222 million tons of consumption. Next year, with our crop and what they think may be coming on in Argentina and Brazil, 246 million tons of production and 231 million tons of consumption. So a growth of consumption of 9 million tons, but a growth in production of 26 million tons. Obviously, we're going to wind up in a situation if we have the big crops in South America, with a lot of extra supplies on the market come April, May, June. And, you know, I'm not going to say what that portends for price, but obviously if you got a lot of it sitting around, the buyers are going to be in control after that period. But the buyer is definitely not in control until that big crops come on in South America next year. Then we don't know what the production will be down the road. As John says, he doesn't know what he's going to plant next year, and none of the farmers know exactly what they're going to plant. We'll look at market conditions as the time passes. The largest soybean importers in the world, China. It's in red. That's why I put it there, because it's such a dominant importer of imports of soybeans. As you can see, if you look down the list, the EU used to be the big one. Now it's relatively dwarfed by China. Japan, Mexico, Taiwan, Argentina, Thailand, Indonesia. Thailand and Indonesia are large importers of soybeans. And then you can see Malaysia down further down the list as far as this region. But China has been the driver. Here's China's imports of soybeans from all origins. That's a phenomenal graph. I've got one that's better in a minute that I think is the more telling graph of what's happened with change in policy. But it shows again how big as an importer they are. In fact, this is imports by China and the rest of the world of soybeans. You can see China has grown so much that it's actually caused the rest of the world's imports to go down because they are in fact buying so many. Projected this next year that China will import more soybeans than the rest of the world combined. And that's been the major factor impacting the soybean sector, no question about it. This is global exports of soybeans versus exports of soybean products, meal and oil combined. The fact that meal and oil are that close to exports of whole soybeans is pretty phenomenal considering how many beans China's taking. But, in fact, the rest of the world, particularly here in Southeast Asia, where you're mainly importing meal, continued to grow. Middle East is bringing in a lot of meal, and that's the major factor. And plus, we got China taking 2.1 million tons of soybean oil. So, again, just a trend line that's out there. Meal and oil demand is still growing as far as in terms of trade. The largest soybean meal consuming markets, Europe is still the largest, China is second, and it's about to surpass Europe. The U.S. used to be the largest 3 or 4 years ago, and now we're down to third, as we've seen our consumption decline, mainly because a lot of distillers' grain that's in the market today is competing with soybean meal. But the farmer in the U.S. looks at it saying, I'm growing the corn, I'm growing the soybeans, do I really care which one, in fact, is consumed in the market? Chinese soybean meal consumption. This is the graph I think is phenomenal. If you look, 1990, 1991, that is when Deng Xiaoping said to be rich is glorious. And they decided they're going to allow capitalist forces and private enterprise to function, invited private investment into China and said, let's go. Look what's happened to soybean meal consumption since then. Almost straight on a 45-degree angle, up consistently through that region, and it's because of people in China wanting to eat meat, eggs, and milk. That's the driver. And we're today probably seeing 5-6 million tons of soybean meal consumed in China solely to feed fish, which is by far the largest aquaculture producer in the world. But again, that tells you what happens when a country decides to, in fact, change policy and get out of state-controlled economy to allow market forces to function. It happens faster in China because without a democracy in place, they can say, do it. It happens. People don't gripe. If you got any good sense, you don't gripe. So that's what's happened there. The largest soybean meal importing markets, you can see it's the EU,